There is a certain kind of man who moves through the digital world without leaving fingerprints. He reads, he watches, he absorbs, but he does not announce himself. His accounts are empty or carefully dormant. No stories, no declarations, no evidence of inner weather. It can look like absence from the outside, but from the inside it rarely feels empty. It feels deliberate, like walking through a room without disturbing the air. In a culture where visibility has quietly become oxygen, choosing not to post is no small thing. Expression is no longer just communication. It is proof of existence. To be seen is to be counted. To be witnessed is to be real. And so when someone opts out, even silently, it presses against something primal. A question forms in the body before it forms in words. If I don't show myself, will I disappear? Many men feel this tension without ever naming it. They sense the pull to post, to explain, to signal progress or virtue or belonging. And at the same time, they feel a tightening in the chest at the thought of exposure. Not fear in the dramatic sense, something quieter, more familiar, a restraint that feels like maturity, or discipline, or control. So silence begins to take on meaning. This is where the emotional stakes live. Visibility today is not neutral. It invites judgment, comparison, misunderstanding, envy, projection. It asks the nervous system to tolerate being misread. And for someone whose earlier experiences taught them that expression leads to ridicule, punishment, or emotional neglect, that invitation does not feel like freedom. It feels like risk. Not posting, then, can feel like survival with dignity intact. There is a deep cultural tension underneath this choice. Expression versus containment. Performance versus sovereignty. The demand to narrate oneself versus the desire to remain intact and unexposed. Modern platforms reward display, while many men are quietly trying to build something inward: clarity, restraint, depth, self-command. Those values do not always translate well into feeds and metrics. So the question isn't whether silence is good or bad. That framing is too crude. The more precise question is this: when a man chooses not to post, what is actually being protected? Because silence can be many things. It can be presence without noise. It can be discernment. It can be strength that does not need applause. But it can also be a sophisticated avoidance, one that feels virtuous enough to escape scrutiny, even from oneself. Carl Jung spoke about the persona as the mask we present to the world, and the shadow as what remains unexpressed, unintegrated, or disowned. Online spaces intensify this tension. Posting is not just sharing content. It is risking that the shadow might slip through the mask. That something unfinished, uncertain, or vulnerable might be seen before it feels ready. For some men, silence becomes a way to ensure that nothing leaks, and yet the body keeps score. Even when the mind frames quietness as discipline, the nervous system still registers what is being avoided. You can feel it in the way drafts are written and deleted, in the way words are rehearsed but never released, in the subtle moral language that forms around opting out. I don't play that game, or I don't need an audience. Sometimes that's true. Sometimes it's wisdom. Other times it's a strategy learned long ago, when being visible carried a cost that was too high. This video is not an argument for posting more. It's not a critique of privacy or restraint. It's an inquiry into the hidden psychological economy behind online quietness, what it protects, what it costs, and how it quietly shapes identity, relationships, and self-trust. Because silence is not empty. It is doing work, whether we ask it to or not. As we move forward, we'll look at how early experiences wire the fear of being seen, how biology steps in to enforce withdrawal, and how what begins as self-control can harden into identity. And at the midpoint, we'll surface a pattern many men mislabel as discipline that is often fear in disguise, not to expose or shame it, but to give it back its context. For now, just notice your own posture as you listen, the breath, the shoulders, the subtle pull towards staying hidden or staying sovereign. There's no need to change anything yet. Awareness alone is enough to begin. Silence can be strength, but strength is not defined by what you withhold. It's defined by whether your quiet is chosen or conditioned. For many men, the discomfort around visibility does not begin online. It begins much earlier, in moments that were never labeled as formative, but quietly were. A comment that landed wrong, a laugh that lingered too long, a truth spoken and met with dismissal, punishment, or emotional withdrawal. Nothing dramatic enough to call trauma at the time, just enough to teach the body a lesson. Expression has consequences, and the nervous system learns faster than language. It stores these moments not as memories, but as rules. Rules about what is safe to reveal, rules about what must be contained. Later, those rules resurface in places that look unrelated. A blinking cursor, a drafted post, a moment of impulse followed by contraction. The adult mind might frame it as discernment or privacy, but underneath, an older calculation is running quietly. If I'm seen too clearly, something could go wrong. This is where Jung's idea of the persona becomes useful, not as theory, but as lived experience. The persona is the face we learn to present so that we can belong without being wounded. It's not fake, it's adaptive, necessary even, but it is selective. It highlights what is acceptable and keeps the rest backstage. The shadow is not what is bad, it is what was never welcomed. Online spaces intensify this split. Posting collapses distance, it flattens context, it invites projection. And for someone who learned early that being misunderstood is dangerous, the fear is not that they will be criticized for something false. The fear is that something true will come out sideways, unfinished, and be judged before it has a chance to integrate. So silence begins to feel safer than misrepresentation. What often goes unnoticed is how much effort this silence requires. Drafts are written with precision and then erased. Words are refined until they lose their pulse. Expression becomes over-edited before it ever leaves the body. Eventually, not posting is framed as a principle. I don't need to explain myself. And sometimes that's accurate. Sometimes explanation really would be unnecessary noise. But sometimes restraint is not humility. It's hyper-control wearing the mask of restraint. Control over tone, control over timing, control over how much of the inner world is allowed to exist outside the skull. This kind of silence doesn't feel peaceful. It feels tight, watchful, like holding your breath just below the surface. There's a subtle pride that can grow here too. A sense of being above the chaos, of not playing the game. And again, this is not inherently false. Many digital environments do reward performance over substance. But when non-participation becomes a moral position rather than a situational choice, it's worth slowing down. Because the shadow does not disappear when it is hidden. It waits. The fear of exposure rarely travels alone. It recruits allies. Biology joins the conversation. The nervous system steps in to make withdrawal feel reasonable, even necessary. What looks like a clean philosophical stance often has a physiological backbone enforcing it. This is not weakness, it's intelligence shaped by experience. As we move forward, the question shifts slightly. Not why don't some men post, but what happens in the body when visibility becomes unpredictable? Because once that layer is understood, silence stops looking like a personality trait and starts looking like a strategy. And strategies, unlike identities, can be examined without self-betrayal. By the time silence becomes a pattern, meaning alone no longer explains it. Something deeper has taken the wheel. For many men who stay quiet online, the core driver is not indifference. It is regulation, a form of self-management learned early when emotional intensity created instability rather than connection. Excitement, joy, pride, even curiosity, these were not neutral states. They were precursors to disruption. Attention could turn into scrutiny. Visibility could turn into loss of control. So the system adapted. Contain the high, flatten the peaks. Stay within a narrow emotional bandwidth. This is why silence often feels calm, even virtuous. It reduces stimulation. It limits unpredictability. It keeps the inner environment manageable. Not posting doesn't just avoid judgment. It avoids activation. From the outside, this can look like low need for validation, independence, self-mastery. And sometimes that reading is accurate. But there is another possibility that deserves equal respect. What looks like independence may be an oversensitized threat system that learned to associate unpredictability with danger. Modern neuroscience gives language to this without pathologizing it. Dopamine is often misunderstood as the molecule of pleasure. In reality, It is more accurately described as the molecule of anticipation. It spikes not when reward is guaranteed, but when outcomes are uncertain. Posting introduces exactly that uncertainty. Will this land? Will it be ignored? Will it be misread? Will it invite comparison or projection? For a nervous system shaped by early instability, that uncertainty does not register as excitement. It registers as threat. So the body quietly says no, even when the mind frames the decision as preference. This creates a reversal that is easy to miss. A man may genuinely feel that he does not crave recognition, and that may be true at the level of conscious desire. But beneath that, the system may be working hard to avoid dysregulation. Not because recognition is unimportant, but because it has historically come with a cost. This is why some men feel more alive in private mastery than in public expression. They can pursue goals, discipline, and growth as long as no witness is required. Progress without exposure feels safe. Dopamine without witnesses is easier to metabolize. There is an ancient image that helps clarify this difference. The monk and the exile both live in silence. From a distance, they look identical. Both are alone. Both are restrained. But one chose silence as devotion. The other was pushed into it by circumstance. One is oriented toward something. The other is oriented away from something. The nervous system knows the difference, even when the story does not. Biology explains the pull toward quiet. It explains why restraint can feel stabilizing, even nourishing. But biology alone does not explain why silence sometimes hardens into identity. Why "I don't post" becomes "this is who I am." Why the absence of expression starts to feel like a moral position rather than a contextual choice. That shift marks an important turning point. Because when silence becomes identity, it is no longer simply regulating stimulation. It is shaping how a man relates to power, intimacy, and agency. It begins to define what kind of visibility feels permissible at all. And that is where the inquiry deepens. Not into whether silence is right or wrong, but into whether it remains flexible, whether it serves life, or whether life has quietly reorganized itself around it. This distinction matters, because what begins as regulation can, over time, become confinement. And confinement, even when it feels calm, slowly reduces range. The question moving forward is not how to become louder. It is how to recognize when quiet is chosen freely, and when it is being enforced from below awareness. Because only one of those allows silence to remain alive rather than defensive. The next chapter sits at that threshold, where autonomy, masculinity, and withdrawal intersect, where what feels like strength begins to reveal its shadow. There is a point where silence stops being a behavior and starts becoming a self-image. It often happens quietly, no declaration, no decision, just a gradual tightening around the idea of independence, needing no one, owing no explanations, staying untouched by the noise, the opinions, the volatility of others. This posture is rewarded in many modern narratives of masculinity. The lone figure, self-sufficient, focused, unavailable to distraction. It carries a certain gravity, a sense of quiet authority, but there is a shadow that can form underneath this stance. What begins as rebellion against dependence can slowly turn into isolation, framed as virtue, not because connection is unwanted, but because needing it once felt humiliating or unsafe. Autonomy then becomes more than freedom. It becomes armor. Jung would describe this as a shadow dynamic, not because independence is wrong, but because something essential is being concealed to preserve the self-image. The shadow here is not weakness. It is longing that was never allowed to mature into trust. Friedrich Nietzsche warned about this exact turn. He spoke of self-overcoming as a path toward greater life, greater vitality, greater truth. But he also cautioned that when resentment is denied, self-overcoming can curdle into self-concealment. What looks like transcendence is sometimes just withdrawal dressed up as philosophy. The danger is subtle. A man may genuinely feel focused, disciplined, and unbothered, and on many levels, he may be. But when silence becomes central to identity, flexibility begins to disappear. Expression starts to feel like a threat to coherence rather than an extension of it. There is a story that circulates quietly in online spaces, often framed as productivity or discipline. A man who did not post, because he was locked in, focused on his mission, protecting his energy. Only later did he recognize something unsettling. His non-posting mirrored his childhood invisibility. Being unseen had once been adaptive. No attention meant no criticism, no disappointment, no emotional demand. What he called focus was also familiarity. This realization didn't invalidate his discipline. It contextualized it. It showed him that part of his autonomy was built on an old absence, not a present choice. Silence had become identity, and identity had begun to organize his relationships around it. When silence reaches this stage, it starts to create distortions. Others may experience the quiet as distance, or superiority, or emotional unavailability. The man himself may feel increasingly misunderstood, even though he is the one withholding context. A loop forms. The less he expresses, the more others project. The more they project, the safer silence feels. What makes this especially difficult to see is that nothing is obviously wrong. Life may be functioning, progress may be happening, there may even be peace, but it is a narrow peace. One that depends on keeping certain doors closed. There is a quiet diagnostic question that lives here, though it doesn't demand an answer. It simply observes. Does silence soften perception over time, or does it harden it? Does it create spaciousness, or does it create rigidity? Does it feel like rest, or like vigilance without an object? These are not moral questions. They are relational ones. Because once silence becomes identity, relationships begin to orient around what cannot be touched. Conversations narrow. Intimacy reorganizes itself to avoid pressure points. Power dynamics shift without ever being named. This midpoint matters because it reframes the entire inquiry. The issue is no longer whether a man should be visible or private. It is whether his quiet stance is expanding his range of choice or quietly shrinking it. What follows from here is not louder expression, but consequence. How this kind of silence echoes into intimacy. How it recreates old relational patterns under new guises. How what once protected the self begins to script relationships in ways that feel familiar but no longer serve. That is where we turn next. When silence becomes more than a personal preference, it begins to speak in relationships. Often, without intention, it recreates a familiar emotional climate. Not the one a man consciously chooses, but the one he learned to survive in. Many men who self-contain grew up with a parent who was unavailable in a specific way. Not always absent. Sometimes present, functional, even providing, but emotionally distant, hard to reach, preoccupied, or unpredictable in their responses. Expression in that environment did not reliably bring comfort or understanding. It brought confusion, dismissal, or a subtle sense of being too much. So the child adapted. He learned to compress himself, to manage feelings internally, to confuse non-expression with maturity. This was not a failure of courage. It was an intelligent adjustment to the conditions he was given. Years later, that same adjustment can quietly organize adult relationships. Digital silence becomes an echo of emotional self-erasure, not because the man wants distance, but because distance once equaled safety. The pattern repeats not as memory, but as atmosphere. He feels grounded in his quiet. Others feel they are reaching into a room that never quite opens. Jung referred to this as repetition compulsion. The psyche attempts to resolve an old wound by recreating its conditions, hoping for a different outcome. Online invisibility can serve this function. It reenacts the experience of being unseen, but this time with a crucial difference. The man is in control, or at least it feels that way. What often goes unrecognized is how silence can carry an unconscious demand. When expression is withheld, others are subtly invited to pursue, to lean in, to ask, to wonder. The dynamic mirrors early attachment patterns, where connection required effort from the child, not the parent. This is where the shock can land. Not posting can unconsciously recreate the very relational tension it once protected against. Distance that once preserved dignity now scripts pursuit, imbalance, and misunderstanding. Intimacy becomes asymmetrical. Power quietly concentrates in the one who withholds. In some cultural contexts, this pattern is reinforced rather than questioned. In high-shame, honor-based environments, visibility can feel like exposure not just of the self, but of family, status, or moral standing. Online invisibility then becomes a way to preserve respect, to avoid scrutiny, to remain unassailable. But the cost is often paid elsewhere. Intimacy thins. Emotional range narrows. Being known becomes conditional. Relationships orbit the perimeter rather than entering the center. Over time, silence can take on a moral dimension. It starts to feel cleaner, more evolved, less needy. The man may genuinely believe he is choosing depth over noise. And again, sometimes he is. But when quietness becomes morally superior, it becomes harder to examine. It stops being a choice among many and starts being the right way to be. This is where the trap tightens, because anything that challenges the stance feels like an ethical threat rather than an emotional one. The paradox is subtle. The original adaptation was born from an unavailable parent. The adult pattern can end up recreating that same unavailability for others. Not out of cruelty, out of familiarity. Understanding this does not require self-criticism. It requires context. Seeing how the psyche protects continuity, even when the conditions have changed. Silence, in this light, is not a flaw. It is a lineage, and lineages can be honored without being repeated. As the inquiry moves forward, the question becomes sharper. When silence is framed as virtue, what power does it hold? Who benefits from it? And what parts of the self are kept safely out of reach, not only from others, but from life itself? That ethical edge is where we turn next. At a certain stage, silence stops being merely personal and begins to carry moral weight. Not loudly, not through declarations, but through implication. I don't need an audience. I don't seek validation. I'm focused on real life. These statements are not false. They often contain real discernment. Many men have seen how public performance can distort values, inflate ego, or pull attention away from what actually matters. Choosing restraint in that context can be sane, grounded, even necessary. And yet, there is another layer that deserves careful attention. Beliefs are never just ideas. They are protections. When a belief repeats itself with unusual certainty, it is often doing defensive work. I don't need an audience can be a declaration of freedom. It can also be a shield against judgment, envy, misunderstanding, or the ache of not being received. What makes this difficult to see is that the belief feels empowering. It restores a sense of control. By withholding expression, the man decides who gets access and who doesn't. He becomes the gatekeeper. Nothing can be taken, because nothing is offered. From a psychological standpoint, this is not neutral. Withholding can function as a form of covert control, not manipulation in the dramatic sense, but regulation of power, the power to remain undefined, unreachable, immune to response. There is relief in that position. No one can misunderstand what they cannot see. No one can diminish what they cannot touch. Silence becomes a kind of high ground. But every high ground has a cost. Human nervous systems are not designed for permanent self-containment. Calm can be maintained in isolation, but aliveness requires exchange. One of the quieter truths of relational neuroscience is that regulation is meant to be shared. Oxytocin, the chemistry of bonding, trust, and emotional safety, is released through attuned contact, through being seen without being overwhelmed. When sharing stops entirely, something subtle happens. The system may feel steadier, less reactive, less disturbed, but it also becomes less responsive, less porous. The emotional range narrows without collapsing. Life becomes manageable, but thinner. This is not a flaw, it is a trade-off. Mythology often captures this pattern more cleanly than psychology. There is the image of the keeper of the gate, a figure tasked with protecting what is inside. Over time, he becomes so devoted to guarding the threshold that he forgets what lies beyond it. The gate is secure, the walls are intact, but the world outside grows distant, abstract. When silence is framed as morally superior, questioning it can feel like betrayal of one's values. That is where inquiry often stops. Not because the stance is wrong, but because it has become untouchable. And yet, ethics are not just about what is avoided. They are also about what is allowed to live. If silence preserves dignity but costs aliveness, the question is not whether it should be abandoned. It is whether it can be integrated. Whether quiet can coexist with selective, sovereign expression. Whether withholding is a conscious choice in each moment, or a default inherited from earlier conditions. This distinction matters, because morality built on avoidance eventually hardens. It stops responding to context. It becomes identity. And identity, once fused with protection, resists evolution. The inquiry here is not accusatory. It is precise. What does silence give you, and what does it quietly take? Those answers are rarely symmetrical, but seeing them clearly opens a third path, one that is neither compulsive expression nor rigid withdrawal, a path where silence is no longer a refuge from life, but a stance within it. That integrated alternative is where this exploration moves next. At the end of this inquiry, the question is no longer whether silence is strength, it is whether silence is chosen. There is a crucial distinction here, and it changes everything. Silence can arise from sovereignty, or it can arise from conditioning, from presence, or from protection, from a grounded sense of self, or from an old nervous system signal that says, stay small, stay contained, stay safe. When silence is chosen, it feels spacious. There is no tension around expression. Words can come or not come without urgency. Visibility is optional, not threatening. The man knows he could speak if it mattered, and that knowledge alone creates ease. When silence is fear-based, it feels heavier, not dramatic, but weighty. Expression feels loaded. Being seen feels risky. Quiet becomes less about peace and more about control. The nervous system may be calm, but it is calm because it has reduced exposure, not because it trusts connection. Seeing this distinction is not an indictment, it is a relief. Many men quietly assume that their patterns mean something is wrong with them, that they are antisocial, avoidant, broken. But what often becomes visible instead is something far more humane. A system responding intelligently to earlier conditions, using modern tools to enforce old lessons. You are not deficient for adapting, you are patterned, and patterns can evolve. Agency returns when expression is no longer compulsory and no longer forbidden. When silence is not a refuge from life, but a position within it. When a man can remain quiet without shrinking and speak without overexposing. When withholding is not an identity, but a situational choice aligned with values and context. Jung described individuation as the process of becoming who you are, rather than who you had to be. In that light, this entire exploration is not about social media. It is about authorship. About whether your inner posture toward visibility belongs to the present or to a past that no longer needs to dictate terms. There is an image that holds this integration cleanly, a sword kept sheathed, not because battle is feared, not because the warrior doubts his strength, but because he decides when it is drawn. The sword is real, the capacity is there, the choice is conscious. Silence, in its mature form, works the same way. It is not absence. It is readiness without compulsion, depth without withdrawal, presence without performance. If something in this reflection mapped your inner experience even faintly, that recognition matters. Quiet signals often go unacknowledged, and naming them can loosen their grip. One line is enough. Not to explain, not to justify, just to signal recognition. It helps others see what you just saw. This is where the exploration rests, not with louder voices, but with clearer choice.